The moment I saw Richard Hargrove standing up in that convertible, waving that American flag like he'd personally won the Revolutionary War, I made myself a promise. I told myself I would not crush this coffee cup in my hand. I would not shout his name across Main Street. I would not do a single thing that a man like Richard would expect a man like me to do. I just stood there on the sidewalk, held my cup, and watched him smile. It was the 4th of July in Mill Haven, Tennessee, and the whole town had turned out for the morning parade the way they did every year. Lawn chairs lined both sides of Main Street 6 rows deep. Kids sat on their fathers' shoulders waving little plastic flags. The high school marching band was somewhere behind Richard's float, playing something loud and patriotic that I couldn't quite name over the noise of the crowd. The air already smelled like sunscreen and fried dough from the vendor carts down by the courthouse. And the sky above our small valley was the kind of deep, perfect blue you only get in early July, before the heat turns everything pale and hazy. I had come alone. I parked my truck 2 blocks off Main, walked over with my gas station coffee, and found a spot near the old hardware store where the awning gave me a little shade and a clean line of sight down the street. I was 62 years old, and I had been watching this parade since I was 7. I knew every turn the route made, every crack in every curb along the way. I had marched in this same parade as a boy, riding in the bed of my father's flatbed truck with Carol beside me, both of us throwing candy to the kids on the sidewalk while Daddy drove and waved his cap out the window. That was a long time ago, a different world entirely. Richard was riding in a white 1967 Ford Mustang convertible borrowed from some car club down in Cookeville. The owner was driving. Richard sat up on the back of the rear seat with his legs hanging down into the car, both arms raised, working the crowd like a man who had spent his whole life practicing exactly this moment. He wore a red polo shirt, pressed khaki trousers, and a straw hat with a little flag pin on the band. His silver hair caught the morning sun. He looked like something out of a campaign poster. And from the way the people around me were clapping, a good number of them believed he deserved to be in one. I heard the woman standing next to me lean toward her husband and say that Richard Hargrove was just the finest man in this county. Her husband agreed without looking up from his phone. I took a long sip of my coffee and said nothing. There was a time, maybe a year or 2 after everything happened, when seeing Richard like this would have put a hot wire of rage right through my chest. I would have felt it in my jaw, in my hands. That particular tightness that comes when you have been wronged in a way that nobody around you seems to see or care about. I know that feeling well. I lived inside it for a long time. But that morning I did not feel rage. What I felt was something quieter and more deliberate. Something close to the feeling I used to get in the Marines the night before a difficult operation, when the planning was done and the equipment was checked, and there was nothing left to do but wait for the hour. I had been waiting for this particular hour for 6 years. Richard's convertible rolled past me at about 10 miles an hour. For just a moment, maybe 2 seconds. His eyes swept my side of the street and landed directly on my face. I did not look away. I did not nod. I held his gaze the way you hold a door open for someone, steady and without ceremony, until he was the one who looked away first. His smile flickered, just barely, like a candle in a draft. Then it came back full, and he turned to the other side of the street and raised his flag again. That flicker was enough for me. The rest of the parade moved past in the way parades do, with color guards and fire trucks, and the Future Farmers of America chapter and the Junior Rodeo Queen on a Palomino horse. A man from my old church waved at me from the Lions Club float, and I raised my cup to him. A group of veterans rode by in a flatbed truck, and I stood straight and put my hand over my heart, the way I always do when the colors pass. Because some things you do not stop doing, no matter what is happening in your personal life. When the last of the parade rolled by, and the crowd began to break up and drift toward the food stands and the picnic areas, I stayed where I was for another minute. I finished my coffee. I looked down Main Street at the thin paper wrappers and candy wrappers the crowd had left on the asphalt, fluttering in the small, warm breeze that came up from the river. Millhaven had no idea what day this really was. They thought it was Independence Day, and I suppose for most of them, it was. But for me, it was something else altogether. It was the day I had chosen. It was the day everything was finally going to be set right. My father bought that land in the spring of 1974, 2 years before I was born. He paid $43,000 for 140 acres of mixed pasture and timber on the eastern edge of Crane County, Tennessee. And he spent the better part of the next 3 decades turning it into something worth being proud of. He cleared the scrub from the south fields himself with a second-hand bulldozer he barely knew how to operate. He built the main barn with his own hands and the help of 4 neighbors over the course of one long August. He ran fence line in weather that would have sent most men inside, and he got up before sunrise every single morning of his adult life to tend to whatever that land required of him on that particular day. His name was Earl James Calhoun, and he was the most honest man I have ever known. I grew up on that farm the way children used to grow up on farms before the world got complicated, which is to say, I grew up understanding that the land was not separate from the family, but was part of it. The same way the kitchen table was part of it, or Sunday church, or the particular sound of my mother humming while she hung laundry on the line out back. The farm was not an investment or an asset or a piece of real estate. It was the place where everything important happened. It was where my father taught me to drive a tractor when I was 9 years old, standing behind me with his hands loose over mine on the wheel. It was where Carol and I caught fireflies in mason jars on summer evenings and sat on the porch until our mother called us in. It was where I came home to after my first tour and stood in the driveway for a long time before going inside, just smelling the air and feeling the ground under my boots and understanding in some wordless way that I was still connected to something real. There was a creek on the eastern boundary of the property, a clear, cold water run that came down off the ridge and cut through a stand of old sycamores before emptying into the larger river about half a mile south. My father called it the Calhoun Branch, though it didn't have that name on any map. He fished it every Saturday morning from April through October, and when I was old enough, I fished it with him. We never talked much during those mornings. We didn't need to. There was an understanding between us that existed below language. The kind of understanding you build not through conversation, but through years of shared work and shared silence and shared mornings on the same patch of ground. He told me once, when I was maybe 13 or 14, and we were sitting on the bank waiting for something to bite, that a man who knows where he comes from is never truly lost. He said it the way he said most things, quietly and without looking at me, like he was stating a simple fact he expected I already knew. I didn't fully understand it then. I was a boy, and I was thinking about baseball and not philosophy. But I never forgot it. Those words stayed in me the way certain things stay. buried under years of living until something cracks the surface and they come back up whole and sharp and urgent. My mother passed in 2008. After that, my father ran the farm alone. He was already in his early 70s by then, and the work was getting hard on him. But he would not hear of selling any part of it or bringing in outside help beyond the occasional seasonal crew for hay. He kept every acre in production, kept the fences tight, kept the barn painted. He was that kind of man. Stopping was not a concept he had much patience for. He started slowing down around 2016. Carol and I noticed it before he admitted it to himself. He was moving more carefully, resting more often, losing weight he could not afford to lose. By 2017, he had been diagnosed with congestive heart failure, and by early 2018, he was largely confined to the farmhouse, spending his days in the armchair by the window that looked out over the south pasture, watching the land he had spent his life building. Richard was there during those months. He was Donna's husband, which made him family, and he presented himself as a man who wanted to help. He drove Earl to doctor's appointments. He brought groceries. He sat with him in the evenings and listened to him talk. And from what Donna told Carol, their father seemed to genuinely enjoy the company. Richard was good at that. He was good at making people feel like they mattered to him. It was the one skill he had developed to perfection over the course of his entire adult life. I was living 20 minutes away, and I came when I could. But I was also dealing with my own health situation that year. A back surgery that had gone sideways and left me largely immobile for the better part of 4 months. I trusted Donna. I trusted that Richard was what he appeared to be. That was my mistake. The only one I needed to make. Earl Calhoun died on a Thursday morning in late September of 2018. He went quietly, the way he had lived, without drama or complaint. Carol was with him. I had driven over the night before and sat beside his bed until past midnight, holding his hand while he slept. And somewhere in those quiet hours, I told him everything I had never quite gotten around to saying out loud. I told him about the farm, how I still knew every inch of it. I told him about the creek and the sycamores. I told him I was sorry I hadn't been there enough in those last years. I don't know if he heard me. I have to believe he did. The funeral was held at Mill Haven First Baptist, where the Calhoun family had attended services for 3 generations. The church was full, because Earl was the kind of man whose absence leaves a visible gap in a community. People drove from 2 counties over. His old farming neighbors came in their good boots and their uncomfortable suits. Men in their 70s and 80s who had known my father since they were young together. And they all said the same things that people say, but they meant them, which made it different. Richard gave the eulogy. He spoke for 12 minutes, and he was very good at it. He talked about Earl's work ethic and his integrity and his love for the land. He made people laugh once and cry twice, and when he stepped down from the podium, he received a standing ovation from half the congregation. I sat in the front pew with Carol on one side of me and an empty space on the other where Donna should have been, and I listened to Richard speak about my father's character, and I kept my face absolutely still. The reading of the will came 10 days later, handled by a local attorney named Frank Giles, who had done routine legal work for half the families in Crane County for 30 years. We gathered in his office, Richard and I and Carol and Giles read the document in the flat, precise voice of a man who has read hundreds of such documents. The will left the farm. all 140 acres, including the structures and equipment, entirely to Richard Hargrove in trust for the benefit of the Calhoun family estate. There was a secondary clause about a small savings account going equally to Carol and me. There was language about personal effects being distributed by mutual agreement, and that was it. I remember the silence in that office after Giles finished reading. I remember looking at the document he slid across the table, the signatures at the bottom, my father's name in a careful cursive. I remember Carol's hand finding mine under the table. And I remember the feeling that moved through me in that silence. Not yet rage, not yet certainty, but something foundational shifting underneath everything. The way the ground shifts in the first seconds of an earthquake before you know whether it will be small or catastrophic. My father had talked to me about the farm. Not in legal terms, not in document language, but in the way he talked about everything. Plainly and directly and without ambiguity. He had told me more than once over the years that the land would go to the family. He had told me he intended for Carol and me to decide together what to do with it after he was gone. He had never, in any conversation I could recall, expressed any intention of leaving it entirely in the hands of his son-in-law. I did not say any of this in Giles's office. I signed where I was asked to sign, shook the necessary hands, and drove home. I sat in my kitchen for a long time with the lights off, thinking about what my father's signature looked like at the bottom of documents I had seen over the years. Birthday cards and insurance forms and the old deed he kept framed in the hallway. I ran that signature through my memory against what Giles had shown us, and I could not make them match. I am not a lawyer. I am not a handwriting expert. I am a man who spent 12 years in the Marine Corps learning to read situations carefully before acting. And what I was reading in that kitchen, in the dark, told me something was very wrong with what had just happened in Frank Giles's office. But I had no proof. I had a feeling, a memory, and a dead father who could no longer speak for himself. Richard had a piece of paper with the right signatures and the right stamps, and in Crane County, Tennessee. That was everything. So I did what the Corps had taught me to do when you are outgunned and not yet in position. I went quiet. I went still. I made no move that would alert the other side to what I was thinking, and I started to plan. The parade crowd was still drifting and settling when Carol found me near the old hardware store. She had a cup of lemonade in each hand, and she gave one to me without asking, which is the sort of thing Carol does, appearing exactly when and where you need her to appear, with exactly what you need, without making a production of it. She was wearing a blue sundress, and her silver hair was pulled back from her face. And for a moment, she looked so much like our mother that it stopped me the way it sometimes does. We stood together watching the street crew begin to sweep up after the parade. The band had stopped playing, and the crowd noise was dropping to a lower, more scattered hum of families making plans for the afternoon. Somewhere down the block, a child was crying about something, the general purposeless crying of a small child who is hot and tired and overwhelmed by too much stimulation. And a father's voice was patiently explaining that the ice cream was coming. Just be patient. Just a little longer. Carol looked at me over the rim of her lemonade cup. She did not ask me how I was doing. She knows better than that by now. She asked me if I had gotten any sleep, and I told her some, which was the truth. I had been up by 4 that morning, sitting on my back porch in the dark with my coffee, going over everything in my mind one more time the way you do even when there is nothing new to go over. just the need to feel the weight of it all in your hands one final time before you set it down. She asked, very quietly, without looking at me, whether I still had it. I told her it was in my jacket pocket. She nodded once and did not ask anything else about it. What I carried in the inside pocket of my light canvas jacket was a standard white business envelope, letter-sized, sealed. Inside that envelope was a document that Dennis Falk had couriered to Carol's house the previous afternoon, a certified copy of a judicial order signed by a justice of the Tennessee Supreme Court, authorizing the seizure and asset freeze of all properties held under the Hargrove estate, pending criminal investigation for fraud, forgery, and the unlawful manipulation of a testamentary document. There was also a separate letter outlining the specific charges and the process for Richard's mandatory appearance before the court within 30 days. Dennis had wanted to have the document served by a process server in a formal legal manner. I had explained to him, in terms he eventually accepted, that I needed to be the one to put it in Richard's hands. Dennis was not entirely comfortable with this, but he was a practical man, and he understood that the document's legal validity did not depend on who delivered it. He made me promise that I would do nothing beyond placing the envelope in Richard's possession. I made that promise with no difficulty at all, because creating a scene was the last thing I wanted. What I wanted was the opposite of a scene. What I wanted was the particular silence that falls when a man opens something in a crowd and realizes, with no possibility of misunderstanding, that his world has just changed permanently and there is nothing he can do about it. I had spent a long time thinking about where and when to make this happen. I could have mailed it. I could have left it on his porch. I could have let the courts handle the formal service in their own time. But this was the 4th of July in Millhaven, Tennessee. And Richard Hargrove had chosen this day, this particular day of all the days in the year, to parade himself down Main Street in a borrowed convertible with an American flag in his hand. He had chosen this day to host his annual party on land that did not belong to him. He had chosen this day to stand in front of his neighbors and perform the role of the distinguished citizen, the upstanding man, the pillar of the community. I thought he ought to receive his news on the same day he had chosen for his celebration. I thought the symmetry was appropriate. I thought my father, who had a quiet and precise sense of justice, would have appreciated the symmetry. Carol was quiet beside me for a little while. Then she said that Daddy would be proud of me. She said it simply, without decoration. And I had to look away down the street for a moment because those words hit me somewhere unguarded. I told her I wasn't doing it to be proud. I told her I was doing it because it was right, and because it was the last thing I could do for him. She put her hand on my arm for just a moment, and then she let it go. We finished our lemonade and walked in separate directions, back to our cars, back to our separate preparations for the afternoon. The sun was climbing toward noon. The town smelled like summer and smoke and cut grass, and somewhere in the distance someone had already started a barbecue grill, and the smell of it drifted across the street and reached me, and for just a moment I was 9 years old again, standing in my father's yard, and everything was still whole. I had not driven past the front gate of that farm in almost 2 years, not because I was afraid of it, but because there is a particular kind of pain that comes from looking at something that should be yours and isn't. And I had learned to manage that pain by keeping my distance on ordinary days. Today was not an ordinary day. Today I had a reason to be there. and reasons change the way a man carries himself when he walks into difficult territory. I parked my truck on the gravel pull-off just past the county road bend, the spot where the property line begins, and the old fence row of cedar trees my father planted in 1982 gives way to the open view of the south pasture. I cut the engine and sat there for a while with the windows down, letting the heat and the cicada noise fill the cab, looking at the land through the gap in the cedars. Richard had changed things. I had known he would. A man like Richard does not acquire something without immediately marking it as his own. The original split-rail fence along the road had been replaced with a manufactured white vinyl fence, the kind you see outside subdivisions and horse properties on the internet. Clean and uniform and utterly without character. The old hand-painted mailbox my father had kept at the end of the lane, the one with the word Calhoun in my mother's careful lettering, was gone. In its place stood a brushed aluminum post with a box that said Hargrove in raised block letters. Small thing. It landed on me like a stone. Beyond the fence, I could see the main barn, repainted a dark red that was too bright and too even. Nothing like the particular weathered crimson my father had maintained over the decades through careful yearly touch-ups. The hay storage addition Richard had built onto the north side of the barn was functional and ugly, a metal-sided structure that had no conversation with the original building, as if someone had bolted a gas station onto the side of a church. Past the barn, the south pasture rolled away toward the tree line, and the grass was high and uneven, not the tightly managed stand my father kept. It was clear the land was being used, but not tended. There is a difference between using land and tending it. And my father had spent 40 years trying to explain that difference to anyone who would listen. I sat there in my truck, and I let myself remember the first time I understood that difference. I was 11 years old, maybe 12. It was a Saturday in May, and my father had given me the job of mowing the south pasture on the old Ford tractor. It was a straightforward enough task, nothing I hadn't done before. But I was in a hurry that morning because some friends were going swimming at the river after lunch, and I wanted to be done in time to go. I cut the job short. I missed a section along the eastern fence line and left it long, figuring it wouldn't be noticed. My father noticed before I had even gotten the tractor back to the barn. He didn't raise his voice. He walked me out to the missed section, stood me in front of it, and asked me what I saw. I told him I saw some long grass. He told me to look again and tell him what I really saw. I stood there not knowing what he wanted, and he said, quietly, that what he saw was a man who had decided that the part nobody was looking at didn't matter. He said that was the beginning of how a man loses himself. He said that the way you do the invisible parts is the truest measure of your character. Then he told me to get back on the tractor and finish the job, and that the river would still be there tomorrow. I finished the job. I missed the swimming, and I never cut a corner on that farm again. By the time Donna died in the spring of 2019, the changes to the farm had already accelerated. Donna's illness had been long and consuming, a kind of cancer that moves slowly and then all at once. And during the worst months of it, I had set aside my suspicions about the will because there were more immediate things to attend to. My sister needed me. Whatever I felt about Richard, Donna was still my blood, and I was not going to let her spend her final months surrounded by conflict. So I kept my peace, and I came when I was needed, and I said nothing about the farm. After Donna passed, something in Richard changed. The careful performance of the grieving widower lasted about 6 months. After that, he began expanding. He brought in a management company from Nashville to run what he called agricultural operations on the property. He put up the metal barn addition. He had the old farmhouse interior renovated, ripping out the pine floors my father had laid himself and replacing them with something polished and generic. He hosted a dinner party there in October of 2019 and apparently gave a tour of the property to his business contacts, describing it as a legacy investment he had been cultivating for years. I heard about the dinner party from a man named Pete Greer, who had known my father and who told me about it with a careful, watching expression on his face, as if he was waiting to see how I would react. I thanked Pete for telling me, and I drove home and I stood in my kitchen for a long time with my hands flat on the counter. And then I decided that the time for quiet patience had passed, and the time for quiet investigation had begun. The first thing I did was go back to the beginning. Not to the farm, not to Richard, but to the document itself. The will. Everything that had happened to my family in the past year flowed from that single piece of paper. And if something was wrong with it, then the wrongness would have a source, and sources leave traces. That was something else the Marines had taught me. Everything leaves a trace. The question is always whether you are patient enough and careful enough to find it. I started with the notary seal. The will had been notarized by a woman named Beverly Schrader, whose office was listed on the document as being located on Chestnut Street in downtown Millhaven. I drove to Chestnut Street on a Tuesday morning in February of 2020 and found that the office space Beverly Schrader had occupied was now a small insurance agency. The agent inside told me the previous tenant had vacated about 14 months ago, paid out her lease early, and left no forwarding address. He said she had been there only about 2 years before that. 2 years. Beverly Schrader had appeared in Millhaven roughly 2 years before my father's death, and disappeared roughly 2 months after the will was executed. I wrote this down in the small spiral notebook I had started keeping in my jacket pocket. I wrote it down and I underlined it twice. I went to the county clerk's office and pulled the notary registration records. Beverly Schrader had registered in Crane County in 2016. Her listed home address was a rental property out on Route 9. I drove out there. The current tenant had no idea who Beverly Schrader was and had been renting the place for over a year. The property management company that handled the rental told me, politely and with some puzzlement, that they were not able to share information about previous tenants. I was not discouraged by these dead ends. Dead ends tell you something. They tell you that someone went to the trouble of creating them, and people do not go to that kind of trouble unless they have something significant to hide. I spent the next several months working through what public records I could access on my own. I pulled the deed transfer documents from the county register, the ones that moved the farm title from Earl Calhoun's estate to Richard Hargrove. I had a retired school teacher in town named Margaret Holloway, who had a talent for research and a particular loathing of dishonesty, help me go through them. Margaret had helped with the school library archives for years, and she understood how to read official documents with the kind of careful skepticism they deserve. She spotted 2 things: I had missed a date discrepancy in the notarization sequence, and a witness signature that appeared on both my father's alleged will and on a completely unrelated property transaction Richard had conducted the previous year. The same witness, 2 different documents, 2 different contexts, 1 name. That name was Gary Tilson. I spent 3 weeks trying to find Gary Tilson. He had lived in Millhaven but had moved. His neighbors told me, to somewhere in Georgia or maybe Alabama. Nobody was sure. His phone number was disconnected. His social media, which I found through Carol's help because I am not naturally inclined towards such things, had been inactive for 2 years. Another trace gone cold. Another careful disappearance. But by the spring of 2021, I had built a pattern. And a pattern is not nothing. A pattern is the shape of an intention. A pattern says that someone planned this, that someone arranged for the pieces to be in place before the event and removed after it. That this was not improvisation, but design. I could not prove forgery yet, but I could see its outline clearly. The way you can see the shape of something submerged in dark water, even when you cannot see the thing itself. It was around this same time that Carol called me about a box. She had been going through the last of our mother's storage items, things that had been at the farm and that Richard, to his minimal credit, had allowed Carol to collect after Donna passed. Among them was a cardboard box of our father's personal papers. The kind of miscellaneous accumulation that a man builds up over a lifetime. Old letters and receipts and photographs and notes. Carol had set it aside, meaning to go through it properly, and had not gotten around to it until that spring. She found the notebook near the bottom of the box, under a stack of old Farm Bureau newsletters. It was a standard composition notebook, the black and white kind you can buy at any drugstore, and it was about 2/3 filled with our father's handwriting. His late handwriting, Carol said, the kind that had gotten smaller and more effortful in his last years. The letters pressed hard into the page, the way a man presses hard when his hand is not entirely steady, but his intention is absolutely certain. She brought it to my house on a Wednesday evening and set it on my kitchen table without a word. And I sat down in front of it and opened it. And I began to read my dead father's voice speaking to me out of the silence of 3 years. My father was not a man who kept a diary in any formal sense. He did not record his days or catalog his feelings or write about the weather and his meals the way some people do. What he wrote in that composition notebook was something more specific and more deliberate than a diary. It was a record of his thinking, a working document of the things he was trying to sort out in his mind during the last years of his life, when his body was slowing down and he had more hours in the chair by the window than he knew what to do with, and he needed somewhere to put the things that mattered. The early pages were practical. He wrote about the farm, about which fields he thought should be rested and which should stay in production. He wrote about the tractor, notes about the engine that needed attention. He wrote a careful accounting of what the property taxes had been running and what he expected they would be. He wrote about the creek, about how the water level had been lower than usual for the past 2 summers, and what he thought might be causing it. Reading those pages was like standing beside him in the south pasture on a cool morning, listening to him think out loud about the land he loved. Partway through the notebook, the writing changed. It slowed down and became more personal, more searching. He wrote about my mother, about how he still missed her every day, and how the farmhouse felt wrong in a way he could not fully articulate without her in it. He wrote about Donna's illness with a plainness that was almost unbearable to read. The way he described watching his daughter diminish and being unable to stop it. He wrote about Carol with warmth and pride. He wrote about me with a directness that made me have to set the notebook down twice and look at the ceiling before I could continue. He wrote that he was proud of my service, but that he had always worried I had inherited too much of his own stubbornness, which he considered both his greatest strength and his most persistent problem. He wrote that he hoped I would find a way to let go of the things that did not serve me. He wrote that the best thing about me, in his estimation, was that when I gave my word, I kept it, and that, in his experience, this was rarer than it should be in the world. Reading those words in my kitchen on a Wednesday evening, I was 60 years old, and I felt like a boy of 15 who had just been handed something he did not know how to hold without breaking it. Near the end of the notebook, about 15 pages from the back, I found what Carol had told me about on the phone. He had written it across 2 full pages, in the careful, slow handwriting of a man taking his time with something important. He wrote that he had been thinking about the creek land, the 10 acres along the Calhoun branch on the eastern boundary of the property. He wrote that for many years he had thought about what would become of that particular piece of ground after he was gone, and that he had come to a clear conclusion about it. He wanted it given to the town of Millhaven. Not sold, given. He wrote that he wanted the town to use the creek land as a public park for families and children, a place where kids could fish and swim and be outdoors the way he had always believed children should be able to be outdoors. He wrote that he had seen too many of the farms around Millhaven get sold and subdivided and paved over, and that he wanted at least this one piece of good land along that clean, cold creek to stay open and free and available to anybody who needed it. He wrote that he intended to speak to an attorney about making this official, that he wanted it in writing and legal and permanent before he was gone. He wrote that he had not yet done this because he had been waiting until he felt strong enough for the trip to town, which he acknowledged with a dry honesty I recognized completely was perhaps not the soundest strategy given his current physical condition. And then the notebook ended. There were no more entries after those 2 pages. Whatever strength he had been waiting for never came, or came too late, or was spent on something else before he could use it for this. I sat at my kitchen table with that notebook in my hands for a long time after I finished reading. The house was quiet around me. The evening light was coming in through the window over the sink at a low angle, the way it does in late spring, throwing long gold lines across the linoleum floor. Outside, I could hear a mockingbird going through its catalog in the maple tree by the back fence, running through every song it had learned in some relentless private performance. I thought about my father in his chair by the window, looking out at the south pasture with those pages of intention already written, waiting for a day of sufficient strength that never came. I thought about those 10 acres along the creek, and about the children who would never fish there, and about the open park that existed only in a dead man's handwriting in a composition notebook that had sat in a cardboard box for 3 years. And then I thought about Richard. I thought about what Richard had taken, and what Richard had buried, and what Richard had stood up in front of a church full of people and praised as my father's great legacy. I closed the notebook carefully. I set it on the table, and I picked up my phone and searched for estate fraud attorneys in Nashville, Tennessee. There is a particular kind of darkness that exists on a country road in rural Tennessee at 2 a.m. in the middle of winter. A darkness that is not merely the absence of light, but seems to have its own weight and texture, pressing against the windows of a truck cab with a quiet insistence that makes a man feel both very small and very alone. I know that darkness well. I spent a number of nights parked on the county road outside my father's farm in the years after the will reading, sitting with the engine off and the heater running low, watching the light in the farmhouse windows the way you watch something that belongs to you from a distance you cannot close. The first time I did it was in January of 2020, About 15 months after my father's funeral. I had not planned it. I had driven out that way after a late evening at Carol's house, a dinner that had gone longer than expected. And on the drive home I had simply turned down the county road instead of taking the highway. The way your hands sometimes take you somewhere, your mind hasn't quite decided to go yet. I pulled off at the cedar tree bend and cut my lights and sat there in the dark, looking at the farmhouse. There was a light on in the front room, the room that had been my father's living room, where his armchair sat by the window and where the framed deed used to hang on the wall beside the door to the hallway. The light was warm and steady, the kind of light that comes from a television or a lamp. And in its glow, I could see the outline of the porch my father had rebuilt in '96. The wide, flat boards he had cut himself from timber off the property, fitted together with a carpenter's precision that had nothing to do with formal training and everything to do with the refusal to do a thing poorly. Richard was in that house. Richard was sitting in some version of comfort in the rooms my father had built, on land my father had cleared, under a roof my father had repaired every spring without complaint for 40 years. Richard was there and my father was in the ground at Millhaven First Baptist Cemetery. And the deed on the wall, if it was still there, had a different name on it now. I sat with that knowledge in the dark for a long time, and I will not pretend it was easy. There is a particular conversation a man has with himself in those moments, and it is not always a polite conversation. The part of me that had spent 12 years in the Marine Corps, that had been trained to respond to a threat with direct and decisive action, that understood instinctively the language of force and confrontation. That part was not quiet on those winter nights. It made its arguments clearly and without apology. It pointed out that I knew where Richard was, that I knew the road, that I knew the layout of that property better than Richard ever would, that there were 100 ways a determined man with military training could make a wrong thing feel like justice in a matter of minutes. I listened to those arguments the way you listen to a voice that has your own accent and your own cadence but is leading you somewhere you cannot come back from. I listened and I did not dismiss them, because dismissing them would have been dishonest. And I have tried my whole life to be honest with myself, even about the worst of what I am capable of. I acknowledged the arguments. I sat with them. And then I thought about my father. I thought about what my father would have said if he had known I was sitting in that truck having that conversation with myself. I knew exactly what he would have said, because I knew how he thought and how he spoke and what he valued above everything else. He would have said that a man who wins by becoming something he is ashamed of has not won anything worth having. He would have said it quietly, without drama, in the same tone he used when he told me that the way you do the invisible parts is the truest measure of your character. He would have been right. He was almost always right, which was occasionally inconvenient, but mostly just a fact of life I had learned to accept. So I sat in my truck, and I did not move. I watched the light in the window until it went out sometime around 3 in the morning. And then I sat in the complete dark for another 20 minutes, and then I started my engine and drove home. I did this 4 or 5 more times over the following 2 years, always late, always alone, never announced. I am not entirely sure what I was looking for on those nights, or what I was proving to myself by going there. Maybe I was keeping a kind of vigil. Maybe I was reminding myself of what was at stake, making sure the weight of it stayed real and present so that the long, slow work of building a legal case did not become abstract or theoretical in my mind. Or maybe I was just a son who needed to be near his father's land in the dark, even when the land no longer recognized his name. On the last night I parked there, which was in the autumn of 2022, I looked at the farmhouse for a while, and then I looked up at the sky above the ridge, which was clear and full of stars the way it gets in October, when the humidity finally breaks. And I made myself another promise. I promised that the next time I came to this property after dark, it would be because the work was done, and the truth had been established, and the land was on its way back to where it belonged. I kept that promise too. Dennis Falk had an office on the 5th floor of a building on Church Street in Nashville. The kind of office that told you immediately that the man inside it was serious about his work without being showy about his success. There were no framed award plaques on the walls, no vanity photographs with politicians or celebrities. There were bookshelves floor to ceiling, a large work table covered in organized stacks of documents, and 2 windows that looked out over the street below with the particular quality of light that comes through old glass. He was a compact, careful man in his early 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the manner of someone who had learned over many years to listen before he spoke. I had called his office in June of 2021, and his assistant had told me he was booked 3 months out. I told her I had a case involving will forgery, a fraudulent notarization, a disappeared witness, and a document discrepancy that a trained eye could spot. She put me on hold for 2 minutes and came back and said he could see me the following Thursday. I brought everything I had. The photographs I had taken of the original will documents at the county clerk's office, the notes Margaret Holloway and I had compiled about the date discrepancy and the repeated witness signature, the information about Beverly Schrader's sudden appearance and disappearance from Millhaven, the details about Gary Tilson, my father's composition notebook. Dennis read through everything I had brought over the course of 2 hours while I sat across from him and drank the worst coffee I had tasted since active duty. When he finished, he took his glasses off his forehead and put them on and looked at me over the rims. He said I had done solid preliminary work. He said the date discrepancy alone was a significant red flag. He said the repeated witness signature across 2 unrelated Richard Hargrove documents was the kind of thing that made courts very interested. He said the disappeared notary was consistent with a paid facilitator arrangement, which he had seen before in estate fraud cases. He said the composition notebook, while not legally binding as a will, established credible evidence of Earl Calhoun's actual intentions and directly contradicted the terms of the alleged will. Then he told me the hard part. He said building a case strong enough for criminal charges rather than just a civil dispute was going to require locating at least one of the disappeared individuals, either Beverly Schrader or Gary Tilson, or finding a forensic document examiner willing to testify about the signature irregularities. He said this would take time and money and no guaranteed outcome. I told him I had time. I told him I had some money saved. I told him the outcome was not the point. The point was doing the thing correctly, all the way through, so that whatever happened, it could never be undone or questioned. He looked at me for a moment, and then he nodded and said he understood completely, and I believed him. What followed was 2 years of the most painstaking and unglamorous work I have ever been involved in, and I spent 12 years in the military, which is not an institution known for glamour. Dennis hired a forensic document examiner from Knoxville named Patricia Wynn, who spent 4 months analyzing the signature on my father's alleged will against every authentic Earl Calhoun signature we could locate. Her conclusion, delivered in a 40-page report with technical language I mostly could not follow, but whose bottom line I understood entirely, was that the signature on the will was inconsistent with authentic samples to a degree that could not be explained by age or illness alone. Gary Tilson was located in Birmingham, Alabama, in the spring of 2022, working at an auto parts warehouse. Dennis's investigator found him through a combination of employment records and a distant cousin's social media. Tilson was initially reluctant to speak. He was a man who had clearly spent 2 years being afraid of something. But when Dennis's investigator explained the seriousness of his legal exposure as an accessory to fraud, Gary Tilson found his willingness to cooperate. He provided a sworn statement confirming that Richard Hargrove had paid him $1,500 to sign as a witness on 2 documents in the fall of 2018. He said he had not known what the documents were and had not read them. He said Richard had told him it was routine business paperwork. With Patricia Wynn's forensic report and Gary Tilson's sworn statement, Dennis filed the complaint with the Tennessee Attorney General's office in the fall of 2023. The investigation that followed was thorough and slow and mostly invisible to anyone in Millhaven who was not me. I knew about it because Dennis kept me informed, calling me every few weeks with brief factual updates in the manner of a man who respects his client's need to know without feeding unnecessary anxiety. The judicial order had come down in late June of this year. Dennis called me on a Thursday morning and told me in his even, careful voice that the Tennessee Supreme Court had signed the asset freeze order and that the criminal referral was proceeding. He asked me how I wanted to handle the service of the order. I told him I had some thoughts about that. He listened, and eventually he agreed. Sitting in my truck on the county road outside the farm that afternoon, with the envelope in my jacket pocket and the party noise beginning to drift from the direction of the house, I thought about Dennis Falk and Patricia Wynn and Gary Tilson's fear and my father's careful handwriting in a composition notebook. And I thought about how many separate acts of ordinary persistence had been required to bring this single day into being. Nobody was going to make a movie about any of it. Nobody was going to write about the Tuesday morning I drove to a vacant office on Chestnut Street, or the hours Margaret Holloway spent with a magnifying glass over county records, or the 4 months Patricia Wynn spent analyzing ink and paper pressure and the precise angle of an old man's pen. But it was all real. Every bit of it was real and solid and true, and that, I had decided a long time ago, was the only kind of foundation worth building on. I pulled through the gate of my father's farm at 2:30 in the afternoon, and the first thing I noticed was that Richard had put a new cattle guard across the entrance, one of those heavy steel pipe affairs that rattle and clang when you drive over them. My father had never seen the need for a cattle guard at that entrance. He had used a simple gate on a post, the kind you lift and swing by hand, because he believed that a gate you have to get out of your truck to open keeps you honest about how often you are actually coming and going from your own property. I drove over Richard's cattle guard and felt it vibrate up through the frame of my truck and into my hands on the wheel. And I thought about my father's gate. And I thought about the difference between a man who tends a place and a man who simply owns it. The driveway was a 1/4 mile of packed gravel that curved gently through a stand of old black walnut trees before opening onto the main yard in front of the farmhouse. Richard had lined the driveway with small solar landscape lights, the kind that glow a weak amber at night and look festive for about 1 season before they start to look neglected. Most of them were tilted or half buried from the winter frost heaves, and nobody had straightened them. My father would have had them all standing level within a week of noticing they were crooked. The yard, when I came through the walnut trees, was full of people and noise, and the particular organized chaos of a well-funded 4th of July party. There were folding tables covered in red and white checked plastic cloth, weighted down at the corners against the afternoon breeze. There were coolers everywhere, the big 100-quart kind, packed with ice and drinks. Someone had set up a cornhole game in the side yard, and a group of men in their 40s were playing it with the competitive intensity of people who have had 2 beers and plenty of time. Children were running in the grass near the old fence line, doing what children do at outdoor parties, which is to say they were running for no particular reason, in no particular direction, with the pure animal pleasure of having space and permission. The smell hit me before I had fully stopped the truck. Hickory smoke and charcoal, and the specific rich sweetness of pork cooking low and slow. A smell that is as deeply encoded in my memory as any smell I know, because it is the smell of every summer of my childhood on this same ground. My father had cooked on that same patch of ground behind the barn every 4th of July from as far back as I could remember. A simple affair with a homemade cinder-block pit and a steel grate and whatever we had raised or grown that year. The smell was identical. The context was entirely different. I parked at the edge of the yard near the walnut trees and sat in my truck for a moment before getting out. I had been to this property in my mind 1,000 times over the past 6 years, but I had not actually stood on it since the month after Donna's funeral, when I had come with Carol to collect the last of our mother's things from the storage room off the back porch. That visit had been brief and functional and painful in a muted way, like touching a bruise through a layer of clothing. This visit was going to be different. This visit, I would have to walk across this ground and breathe this air and look at everything Richard had done to it. And I would have to do all of that while carrying a sealed envelope in my jacket pocket and keeping my face as neutral as a man reading a newspaper on a park bench. I got out of the truck. The afternoon heat settled on my shoulders immediately. That flat, heavy Tennessee July heat that doesn't move or breathe. It just sits on you. I straightened my jacket, checked that the envelope was secure in the inner pocket, and walked toward the gathering. Carol appeared at my elbow within 30 seconds, which told me she had been watching for me. She had changed from her morning sundress into a pale yellow blouse, and she was carrying a plate of food she had clearly just loaded up from one of the tables. She handed it to me without ceremony, a pulled pork sandwich and some coleslaw and a handful of potato chips. And I took it, because refusing food Carol hands you is not a battle worth having. We walked together toward the far end of the yard, away from the densest part of the crowd. And I ate and looked at the farmhouse. Richard had painted it too. A clean white with dark green shutters that was attractive in an anonymous way. The kind of color scheme you see on real estate listings. My father had kept it white too. But his white was the white of a house that has been painted many times over many years by the same careful hands, with the particular texture of age and intention. This white was fresh and smooth and told you nothing about the people who had lived inside. Carol said quietly that Richard had been holding court near the main grill for the past hour, telling everyone who would listen about his plans to expand the hay operation next year. I told her that was fine. She looked at me with the particular expression she has when she is checking whether I am actually fine or merely performing fineness. And I gave her the small nod that means the former. I was fine. I was more than fine. I was exactly where I needed to be, doing exactly what I had planned to do, on exactly the day I had chosen. That is a feeling very few people get to have, and I was aware of it, and I was grateful for it. Richard found me about 20 minutes after I arrived, which I had expected. A man like Richard cannot leave a guest unacknowledged for long, especially a guest whose presence represents a kind of unresolved tension that requires active management. He came across the yard with a drink in his hand and his party smile fully operational. The wide, easy smile of a man who has practiced it so long it no longer requires any conscious effort to deploy. He was wearing a white linen shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and pressed khaki shorts and boat shoes without socks. The full summer costume of a man who wants to project relaxed prosperity. His silver hair was combed back from his face, and he had a slight tan from what I guessed was a recent weekend somewhere with water. He looked healthy and comfortable and entirely at home on ground that was not his, and he carried himself with the specific confidence of a man who has never seriously entertained the possibility that his version of events might not be the permanent one. He shook my hand when he reached me. His grip was firm and practiced. He said it was good to see me, that he was glad I had come, that he hoped I had helped myself to the food. He said the pork had been on since 4 that morning, that he had a man from down in Lawrence County who did all his events and who was, in Richard's estimation, the finest pitmaster in the state of Tennessee. He said this with the particular enthusiasm of a man sharing something he considers impressive, watching for the appropriate response. I told him the food was excellent. This was true. Whatever else Richard had arranged for this party. The man from Lawrence County knew what he was doing. Richard stood beside me for a few minutes, doing what he does, which is talking pleasantly about nothing in particular, while simultaneously taking inventory of the situation around him. He mentioned a couple of business things. A property deal he was working on in Cookville, a zoning change he was following in the county. He mentioned that he was thinking about putting a small pond in the low field on the south end of the property, that he thought it would be a nice addition and might attract some good duck hunting in the fall. He said this without any apparent awareness of how it might land on me, whether through genuine obliviousness or through the practiced performance of it, I could not entirely tell. I listened and nodded and said very little. I am good at listening and nodding. The Marines teach you that a man who controls how much he reveals controls the conversation, regardless of who is doing most of the talking. After a few minutes, Richard drifted back toward the grill and his audience of admirers, and I watched him go and felt nothing particular except a quiet, steady patience that had become so familiar over the past 6 years that it felt like a natural condition rather than an effort. I finished my food and set the plate on a nearby table and walked slowly toward the back of the property, toward the tree line and the creek. The path to the Calhoun branch ran along the eastern edge of the property behind the old equipment shed, through a stand of second-growth timber that my father had always kept clear of underbrush to make walking easy. The path was still there, still worn into the ground by decades of footsteps, though it was narrower now from disuse and the brush on both sides had begun to crowd in. I walked it slowly, ducking under a low elm branch that had grown across the path since I was last here. And after about 300 yards, the timber opened up and I came out onto the bank of the creek. The Calhoun branch was running clear and low the way it does in July, maybe 8 inches of water over the smooth limestone bed, moving quietly between banks of exposed root and river grass. The old sycamores were there, all of them, enormous and patient, their pale bark catching the afternoon light in a way that made them look almost luminous against the dark of the timber behind them. The air near the water was 5 degrees cooler than the open yard, and it smelled of wet stone and creek mud and the particular green smell of water plants in summer. A smell so specific and so unchanged that it reached into some place in me that had nothing to do with reason or planning or legal documents. I stood on the bank and looked at the water moving over the limestone, and I thought about my father. Not the abstract thought of him I had been carrying for 6 years. The thought that was tied to injustice and evidence and legal proceedings, but the direct, simple, ungarnished thought of him as a man. His hands, his voice. The way he moved through this same space, unhurried and certain, as if the ground recognized him and made itself comfortable under his feet. The way he would find a flat rock near the water and sit on it without ceremony. Unwrap his lunch from the wax paper Carol always packed it in, and eat it looking at the creek with the expression of a man who has everything he needs exactly where he is. I thought about the 10 acres along this bank that he had wanted to give away. I thought about the children he had imagined fishing here, children who had no connection to the Calhoun name or the Calhoun history, children who would simply come to a clean, cold creek on a summer afternoon because it was there and it was free and someone had thought enough of them to leave it open. I thought about what kind of man thinks that way in the last pages of a composition notebook, when his body is failing and his time is short, and he could easily have been thinking only about himself. The creek moved past me, indifferent and unchanged. The same water that had been running through this same cut in the Tennessee earth since long before my father or his father or anyone named Calhoun had ever set foot on it. It would be running here long after all of us were gone. And what mattered? What was the only thing that ever really mattered was what we chose to do with the piece of time we were given on its bank. I stood there for a long time. Then I turned and walked back toward the party. When I came back through the equipment shed path and into the main yard, the party had reached that particular mid-afternoon pitch where everyone is fed and comfortable, and the conversations have loosened into the easy rambling talk of people who have nowhere else to be. The cornhole game had expanded to include more players. Someone had set up a Bluetooth speaker near the back porch playing classic country at a volume that was present without being intrusive. Old Merle Haggard and George Jones. The kind of music my father had kept on the radio in the barn every working day of his life. I got a glass of sweet tea from the drink table and found a quiet spot near the corner of the old equipment shed, in the shade of the overhang, where I could see most of the yard without being in the middle of it. From here I could watch Richard moving through his guests, working the crowd with the same fluid efficiency he had used on Main Street that morning, touching shoulders, laughing at the right moments, leaning in close when someone said something he wanted to appear to find important. He was very good at it. He had always been very good at it. That was the thing about Richard that had made him so effective and so dangerous. His performance of decency was indistinguishable from the real thing to anyone who didn't have a reason to look carefully. I had been standing there for about 10 minutes when I felt my phone vibrate in my shirt pocket. I took it out and looked at the screen. It was a text from Dennis Falk. 4 words, everything is in order. I read it twice, put the phone back in my pocket, and took a slow sip of my sweet tea. Those 4 words were the last piece. They confirmed that the legal machinery was fully engaged and moving, that the asset freeze order was active and on record, that the criminal referral was proceeding through the proper channels, and that the document in my jacket pocket was precisely what it said it was. valid and binding and beyond any procedural challenge Richard's attorneys might attempt in the coming days. Dennis was meticulous about these things. 4 words from Dennis Falk meant the same thing as 40 pages from anyone else. I set my glass down on the edge of the equipment shed windowsill and reached into my jacket and touched the envelope once through the fabric. Just a brief contact. The way you check a tool before you use it. It was there. It had been there all day. It would be there tonight when the time came. I thought about what the next 12 hours were going to look like for Richard Hargrove. I thought about it not with satisfaction exactly, not with anything as simple or as hot as pleasure, but with the particular clarity of a man who has spent a long time in the dark and can now see the full shape of where he has been and where he is going. Richard would receive the envelope tonight. He would read it. He would understand it. He would spend tonight and tomorrow and every day after that living with the consequences of a decision he had made in the fall of 2018. When he had decided that a dying man's trust was something he could use. I did not feel triumphant standing there in the shade of my father's equipment shed with my sweet tea and my envelope. What I felt was closer to what I imagine a surgeon feels in the last moments before a long and difficult procedure. A kind of focused, deliberate calm that is not the absence of emotion, but the mastery of it. Every feeling I had about this situation, the grief and the anger and the years of patient waiting, all of it had been refined down into this one clear afternoon, this one specific task, this one envelope in one inside pocket waiting for one moment. The afternoon wore on in the way long summer afternoons wear on, slowly and warmly, with the light beginning its gradual shift from the flat white heat of midday toward the softer gold of early evening. People began collecting their children and consolidating at tables for a second round of food. Richard made a brief speech near the grill, something about the 4th of July and community and gratitude, and people applauded, and someone near the back gave a whoop. And Richard looked exactly as he always looked in these moments, like a man who is exactly where he believes he deserves to be. I watched the speech from my corner. When it was over, I caught Carol's eye across the yard. She was sitting with a group of women near the porch, and she looked at me with a question in her expression. A small lift of the chin that meant, "How are you holding up?" I gave her the same small nod from that morning. She turned back to her conversation. The evening was coming. Beyond the ridge to the west, the sun was dropping toward the tree line, and the quality of the light was changing, thickening into that deep amber that precedes the slow purple of a Tennessee summer dusk. People were beginning to talk about the fireworks, about heading into town for the display, about where to park and where to stand for the best view. The annual fireworks show over Millhaven's Central Park was a tradition as old as the town itself, and on a clear night like this one promised to be, people would come from 3 counties to watch it. Richard was already organizing his departure with the efficiency of a man who always knows where the best seats are. I heard him tell someone he had a reserved spot in the VIP area near the bandstand, arranged through the county commission. Of course he did. Richard always had a reserved spot. I finished my sweet tea. I straightened my jacket. I waited for the yard to begin emptying toward the cars, and then I walked to my truck and followed the taillights down the gravel drive toward the county road and the lights of Millhaven in the darkening valley below. The town park in Millhaven sits at the center of the original town grid. 4 blocks of open grass and old oak trees surrounding a white painted bandstand that has been there since 1922. On ordinary days, It is where old men play checkers and young mothers push strollers along the gravel paths, and the occasional dog walker circles the perimeter in the early morning. On the 4th of July, it becomes something else entirely, a gathering point for every person within 20 miles who wants to be somewhere communal and lit up and loud, which on this particular evening appeared to be most of the known world. I parked 3 blocks away and walked in. Moving with the general current of families and couples and groups of friends, all flowing in the same direction, all carrying lawn chairs and blankets and coolers of varying sizes. The sky above the oak trees was a deep, saturated blue, deepening toward purple at the edges. That particular color of a clear summer sky in the last 20 minutes before full dark. And the first stars were beginning to show above the eastern ridge. The air had cooled by maybe 8 degrees from the afternoon peak, and there was a light breeze moving through the trees that made everything feel cleaner and more alive. The park was already dense with people when I arrived. Every available patch of grass had been claimed with blankets and chairs, and the crowd had that particular festive electricity that comes from several thousand people gathered in one place in the open air at night, waiting for something beautiful to happen in the sky above them. Children were running with glow sticks. Vendors were moving through the crowd with light-up toys and bags of kettle corn. Someone near the bandstand was playing a fiddle, a cheerful improvised reel that cut through the crowd noise with a clean, high sound. I moved slowly through the crowd, not pushing, not hurrying, working my way toward the bandstand area where the VIP section was cordoned off with a low rope barrier and a few folding chairs set on a raised wooden platform that gave a marginally better sightline to the sky. I could see Richard already there, standing near the front of the platform with a group of people I recognized as county officials and local business owners. The particular cluster of men who constitute the visible power structure of a small Tennessee county. He had a drink in his hand, and he was laughing at something, his head thrown back in the full performance of enjoyment. I did not go to the VIP section. I found a spot about 30 feet back from the rope barrier, in the open grass, where I had a clear view of Richard's position and enough surrounding crowd that I was simply one more person among thousands. I stood there and let the crowd settle around me and checked the envelope one more time through my jacket fabric and watched the sky begin to darken fully above the old oak canopy. Carol was somewhere in the crowd. We had agreed that morning that she would not be near me when I approached Richard, that this was something I needed to do alone and without witness from anyone who shared my blood. She understood this. Carol has always understood more than she needs to be told. The first firework went up at 9 o'clock exactly. A single opening shell that climbed the dark sky in a thin, bright line and burst into a white chrysanthemum shape 200 feet above the park. And the crowd made the sound that crowds always make at the first firework. That collective exhale of pleasure and anticipation. The specific sound of a few thousand people all feeling the same simple thing at the same moment. Children squealed. A dog somewhere behind me barked once and then was quiet. I stood in the light of the first burst and looked at Richard's profile on the platform, 30 feet away. His face turned upward toward the sky with the open expression of a man who is enjoying himself without complication. A man who has no reason at this moment to be anywhere but exactly where he is, surrounded by people who respect him on a night that is, by every visible measure, entirely his. I put my hand in my jacket and closed my fingers around the envelope. The fireworks were coming faster now, 2 and 3 at a time, filling the sky with cascading color, green and gold and red and white, the concussions rolling across the park in overlapping waves of sound that you feel in your chest as much as hear with your ears. The crowd noise had dropped to near silence, everyone looking up. Everyone inside the shared private experience of watching something extraordinary happen in the sky above the ordinary world. I began to move through the crowd toward the rope barrier. I moved the way I had learned to move in the Corps, with purpose and without urgency. The kind of movement that does not draw attention because it contains no hesitation and no performance. I reached the rope barrier and stepped over it quietly. 2 county commissioners standing nearby glanced at me and then looked back up at the sky. Richard was 10 feet away, then 8, then 5. I stopped just to his right and slightly behind him, close enough that when I spoke his name it would be audible to him and only to him. Above us, the sky was on fire with color and noise and light, an enormous American celebration, proceeding in complete indifference to everything happening on the ground below it. I said his name. He turned. He turned with the reflexive social smile already forming on his face, the automatic expression of a man at his own party who has been turning toward people and smiling all day long. The smile made it about halfway to completion before his eyes registered who was standing beside him, and then it stopped, not falling entirely but freezing, like a clock that has lost its mechanism mid-tick. I held the envelope out to him at waist height, between us, low enough that the people around us were unlikely to notice. My hand was steady. I had spent the better part of 6 years arriving at this exact moment, and I was not going to have an unsteady hand at the end of it. I said, quietly and without inflection, that this was for him, that it was a legal document and he needed to read it tonight. He looked at the envelope for a moment before he took it. There was a hesitation in him that I recognized as the hesitation of a man whose instincts are telling him something is wrong, but whose conscious mind has not yet caught up with what it might be. He took the envelope. His fingers closed around it with the automatic grip of a man accepting something he has not yet decided whether he wants. He looked at me. Above us, a series of large shells went up in rapid succession, filling the sky with overlapping blooms of gold and red that lit his face in shifting warm color. And in that light I could see the exact moment his social confidence began to develop a crack, just a hairline, just the beginning of a fissure in the surface of the performance he had been delivering all day. I said nothing more. I had said what needed to be said. He opened the envelope. I watched him read. He was a man who processed written information quickly, a man who had spent decades reading contracts and property documents and legal correspondence, and so it did not take him long to understand the first page. I could track his comprehension through the subtle changes in his face, the way you track the progress of a storm across open water, the initial stillness, then the slight contraction around the eyes, then the shift in jaw, then the almost imperceptible drawing inward that a man does when something cold reaches him in a place he thought was protected. By the second page, his breathing had changed. I could see it in his chest, even in the uncertain light. The rhythm going from the easy, controlled breath of a man enjoying a summer evening to something faster and shallower. The breath of a man whose body has just received news that his mind is still trying to refuse. The fireworks above us were at their full crescendo now. The finale building in the way finales do. Shells coming up faster and faster and bursting lower and larger, the sky completely saturated with color and the noise rolling over us in continuous overlapping waves that made individual sounds impossible to distinguish. It was the loudest part of the entire evening, and it was happening directly above us, and in all of that enormous controlled chaos. Richard Hargrove was standing on a wooden platform surrounded by county commissioners and business associates, holding 2 sheets of paper that were in the process of dismantling everything he had spent 6 years constructing. He lowered the papers. He looked at me. The smile was completely gone now. What was on his face instead was something I had not entirely anticipated. Not rage and not denial, which were the 2 reactions I had modeled in my mind over the years, but something closer to a kind of naked, helpless recognition. The expression of a man who has been carrying a specific fear for a long time and has just seen it arrive in physical form. He had known, somewhere in him, that this was possible. Men who do what Richard did always know somewhere in them that it is possible. They simply bet on the odds that it will not happen to them. He took a breath that I could see was effortful to control. He said my name, just my name, Walter, in a voice that had lost all of its social lubrication and was now just the voice of a man standing at the edge of something he cannot see the bottom of. I looked at him for a moment without speaking. I thought about the things I could say to him. I had thought about this part of the conversation for years, had constructed and discarded dozens of versions of what I might choose to say when I finally stood in front of him with the truth between us. In some of those imagined versions, I had been eloquent. In some, I had been cutting. In some, I had said exactly what his deception had cost my family, named every loss, detailed every year, made sure he understood the full accounting of what his decision in the fall of 2018 had produced. But standing there in the light and noise of the fireworks, looking at the man who had forged my father's name on a piece of paper and stood in a church and spoken about my father's character, I found that I did not want to say any of those things. They were true, all of them. But saying them now, in this moment, would have been about me and my need to be heard. And this had never been about me. It had been about my father. It had been about a composition notebook and a clean, cold creek and 10 acres of land along a ridge in Crane County, Tennessee, that an honest man had wanted to give to children who would never know his name. So I said only one thing. I said that my father was an honest man, and that the land would go back where it belonged. Then I turned and walked back through the crowd, into the noise and the light, and the 10,000 faces all turned upward toward the sky. I walked back through the crowd, the way a man walks when the hardest part of a long journey is finally behind him. Not quickly, not with any visible urgency, just steadily. One step after another through the press of bodies and the noise and the cascading light. People moved around me without noticing me, their faces all tilted upward toward the fireworks, their eyes full of color and their mouths open in the particular expression of uncomplicated pleasure that a good fireworks show reliably produces in human beings, regardless of age or circumstance. I moved through them like water moving through stones, quiet and without resistance, and I did not look back. I found an open space at the far edge of the park, near the old iron fence that borders the cemetery on the north side, where the oak canopy thins out and you get a clean, unobstructed view of the sky. There were fewer people here, mostly older couples sitting in folding chairs with blankets across their laps. the ones who had learned over the years that the best view is not always the closest one. I stood at the fence with my hands in my jacket pockets and looked up. The finale was still building. Shell after shell climbed the dark Tennessee sky and broke open in cascading, overlapping flowers of light. Gold and silver and deep red and the particular blue-white that looks almost like lightning, each one fading before the next arrived, so that the sky was never fully dark, but never fully bright either, existing in a continuous state of becoming. The sound was enormous and immediate, each concussion landing in the chest like a fist, not unpleasant. The kind of physical sensation that reminds you that you are a body in a world and not merely a mind floating above it. I stood there, and I let the fireworks wash over me, and I thought about nothing in particular for the first time in a very long time. Not about Richard, and not about the envelope, and not about what would happen in the days and weeks ahead when the legal process moved forward in its methodical and inevitable way. Not about the farm or the deed or the creek, just the sky. Just the light breaking open above a small Tennessee town on the 4th of July. The same sky my father had watched from this same park when he was a young man. The same sky I had watched as a boy sitting on his shoulders. The same sky that had been breaking open in this same way every July for as long as anyone in Millhaven could remember. Behind me, somewhere in the crowd, I knew that Richard was standing on his wooden platform holding 2 sheets of paper that had just ended the world as he had arranged it for himself. I knew that the men standing near him were still looking up at the fireworks, unaware of anything unusual, and that Richard was either doing a very good job of composing himself or was not, and that either way, the outcome was the same. The document was served. The order was active. The machinery was in motion and could not be recalled by any action Richard might take tonight or tomorrow or any day after that. Dennis had made sure of that. Patricia Wynne had made sure of that. Gary Tilson, frightened Gary Tilson in his Birmingham warehouse, had made sure of that by telling the truth when it finally cost him something to do so. A large shell went up directly overhead and broke into a shower of gold that fell slowly, slowly, burning out one particle at a time as it descended. And in the light of it, I could see the old cemetery headstones beyond the iron fence, white and gray and patient in the dark, row after row of them extending back into the deeper shadow of the old trees. My father was buried at the First Baptist Cemetery 3 blocks south of here. But standing at this fence, looking at these stones, I thought about him the way I had been thinking about him all day. Not as a loss, but as a presence. The specific weight and warmth of a man whose influence does not end when his body does. I thought about what he would make of this evening, not the legal mechanics of it, not the strategy or the timing or the particular satisfaction of the symmetry I had chosen. I mean what he would make of it at the level where things are either right or wrong, simple and without qualification. I believed he would have understood it completely. I believed he would have approved of the method, the patience, the use of law rather than force, the refusal to become ugly in pursuit of something right. He had always believed that the way you go about a thing matters as much as what you are going after, that the path and the destination are not separate questions. Whether he would have wanted any of this, whether he would have preferred that his family simply grieve and move forward without the long machinery of pursuit and justice, that I was less certain about. My father was not a man who required vindication. He was not a man who needed the world to acknowledge that he had been wronged. He had a profound and genuine indifference to what the world thought of him so long as he knew himself to be straight with God and his own conscience. But I had not done this for him in the sense of doing it on his behalf. Not entirely. I had done it because it was true, and because true things deserve to be established in the record of the world, and because a man who forges the name of an honest man onto a fraudulent document is not merely stealing property. He is stealing the truth of who that man was and what he intended. And that is a theft that reaches further than any court can fully measure. The finale peaked above me, the sky entirely full now, light overlapping light in a continuous roar that silenced everything else. And I stood with my hands in my pockets and my face turned upward, and I felt the sound of it in my ribs and my jaw and the soles of my boots, and I thought, simply and without drama, that it was enough. That what had been done today was enough. That I could stop now. The fireworks ended the way they always end, with one final enormous burst that fills the entire sky from horizon to horizon, and then goes dark all at once, leaving a silence that feels almost physical after so much noise. The crowd held its collective breath for 1 second, and then exhaled into applause and cheering, and the park filled with the sound of several thousand people expressing their appreciation for something beautiful that was now over. Children cried because it was finished. Old couples folded their blankets. The vendors began breaking down their carts. I stayed at the fence until the applause died down, and the crowd began its slow migration back toward the parking areas. The great shuffling dispersal that follows every public event, unhurried and good-natured. The particular amiable chaos of people who have had a good evening and are not yet ready to let go of it entirely. I watched them go and felt something I had not expected to feel, which was a kind of tenderness toward all of them. These people of Millhaven going home on the 4th of July with their tired children and their folding chairs, their ordinary lives continuing forward in their ordinary ways, unaware that anything in particular had happened in their park tonight beyond the annual fireworks show. I thought about Carol, and I sent her a text that said simply, "Done." Her response came back in under a minute. 2 words, thank God. I stood there with my phone in my hand, reading those 2 words, and I felt something loosen in my chest that I had not fully realized was still tight. Some last held tension in a place I had not known to look for it. Releasing quietly in the dark at the edge of a cemetery in a small Tennessee town while the last of the crowd moved past me toward their cars. I found her near the bandstand 15 minutes later. The VIP platform was empty. Richard was gone, and I did not know where he had gone, and I did not need to know. That part of the evening was complete and belonged now to a process larger and more formal than anything I was personally managing. Carol was sitting on one of the vacated folding chairs with her shoes off and her feet in the grass, looking tired in the comfortable way of someone who has been bracing for something for a long time and has finally been allowed to put it down. I sat in the chair beside her. Neither of us spoke for a minute. The park was quieting around us. The last families moving out through the gates, the grounds crew beginning a slow circuit with trash bags. Somewhere across the park, a child was calling for a parent, in the specific register of a child, who is not yet frightened, but is becoming aware that they might need to be. And then a parent's voice answered, and the child's voice relaxed and went quiet. Carol said that she kept thinking about Daddy. She said she had been thinking about him all day, more than usual, which was saying something because she thought about him most days. She said she had been thinking specifically about the way he used to bring her and me to this same park when we were children. How he would put us on his shoulders so we could see over the crowd. How he smelled like the farm even when he had put on his good shirt. That particular combination of soap and cut grass and something deeper and earthier that was simply the smell of a man who worked outdoors all his life and carried it with him. I told her I had been thinking about him too. I told her about standing at the creek that afternoon, about how unchanged it was, how the sycamores looked exactly the same as they always had, how the water was still the same color over the same limestone. I told her that standing there had felt like a kind of conversation, not with words, but the kind of conversation that happens in a place where someone you loved spent a great deal of their life, where their presence has soaked into the ground and the air and the light in a way that doesn't entirely dissipate just because they are no longer physically there. Carol listened to this without saying anything, which is something I have always valued about her. She does not rush to respond. She lets things settle before she answers, which is rarer than it sounds. After a while, she said that she thought Daddy knew. She said it quietly, without argument or insistence, just as a thing she believed. She said she thought he had known for a long time that what was done to his name and his land would eventually be answered, and that he had trusted us to answer it in the right way, and that we had. She said she thought he was at peace with it, had been at peace with it longer than we had. I sat with that for a while. I am not a man who talks easily about what happens after death, or what the dead know or don't know. I was raised in a faith that has clear positions on these questions, and I have held on to that faith imperfectly over the years, the way most people hold on to most things, with conviction in the good times and with effort in the hard ones. But sitting beside Carol in the emptying park, with the smell of spent fireworks still in the air and the grass cool and damp under our feet, I found that I did not need to resolve those questions tonight. It was enough that Carol believed it. It was enough that it was the kind of thing my father would have believed, quietly and without requiring confirmation. We sat there together for another little while, two middle-aged children of Earl Calhoun, in the park where he had held us up above the crowd so we could see the fireworks, and the night settled around us warm and dark and full of the sounds of a summer town returning to its ordinary quiet. I did not go straight home. I told myself I would. When I walked away from the park and found my truck in the dark 3 blocks off Main Street and started the engine, I told myself I was done for the evening, that the work was finished and there was nothing left to see or do, that a man who has completed what he set out to complete ought to simply go home and let the night be what it is. I believed this for about 6 blocks, and then I turned south on County Road 11 instead of north toward my house, and I drove the 12 minutes out to the farm in the dark without quite deciding to do it, the way I had done so many times in the years before, my hands taking me somewhere my mind had not fully authorized. The difference was that this time I knew why I was going. The county road was empty at that hour, just my headlights moving through the dark tunnel of cedar and oak that lines the road out past the edge of town, the occasional reflective marker post catching my lights and flashing past. The night smelled like cooling asphalt and cut hay, and the particular sweetness of honeysuckle that grows wild along the fence rows out here. Climbing the old wire and the cedar posts in thick ropey masses that bloom all summer and fill the night air with something so specific to this place and this season that it is indistinguishable in my memory from the concept of home itself. I slowed when I reached the cedar tree bend, the pull-off where I had parked so many times in the dark years, and I pulled off the road and cut my headlights. Not the engine, just the lights. I sat in the dark with the engine running low and looked at the farm through the gap in the cedars. The house was dark, all of it. Every window, the porch light off, the yard lights off, the whole property sitting in the deep country dark without a single point of illumination. I did not know where Richard had gone after the park. I did not know whether he was inside that dark house or somewhere else entirely. Whether he was on the phone with attorneys or sitting alone with a drink or simply staring at the ceiling in the specific paralysis of a man whose carefully constructed world has just been informed that it is built on a foundation the court has decided to examine. I did not need to know. Whatever room Richard Hargrove was in tonight, he was in it differently than he had been in any room for the past 6 years. And that was enough. I looked at the dark house for a long time, and I felt the difference between this night and all the other nights I had sat in this same pull-off looking at the same property. The difference was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It was more like the difference between holding your breath and breathing normally. A shift so fundamental that you only notice it by its absence once it is gone. The tightness I had carried in my chest every time I looked at this land. That particular compression that comes from seeing something stolen being openly enjoyed by the thief was not there. In its place was something quieter and more spacious. Not happiness exactly, not triumph, just room. Just the ordinary feeling of a man looking at a piece of ground in the dark, without anything unresolved between them. My father had walked this land for 40 years. He had learned every low place where the water collected after rain, every rise where the soil went thin and rocky, every corner of fence that needed extra attention in the winter, every tree on the property by the particular shape of its canopy against the sky. He had known this land the way you know a person you have lived alongside for a lifetime. Not through study, but through accumulated daily contact. Through 10,000 mornings of the same ground under the same boots in every condition of weather and season and light. That knowledge did not die with him. It lived in me. Imperfectly and incompletely, but genuinely. The way things passed down through years of shared work always live in the people who received them. I knew where the water collected. I knew the thin, rocky rise on the south end. I knew the sycamores by the creek. I had not been on this land regularly in years, and I would not pretend I knew it the way he had known it. But the map of it lived in me in some form that 6 years of distance had not erased, and that Richard Hargrove's vinyl fence and too bright barn had not displaced. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes. I did not try to make it into anything more than it was. A man in a truck on a country road in the dark, looking at a piece of ground that had mattered to his family. On the night that the long work of reclaiming it had finally been set in motion. No ceremony, no speeches. Just the dark and the honeysuckle and the sound of the engine and the farm sitting there in the night. Patient and unchanged in all the ways that actually matter. Waiting for the process to finish and the name on the gate to return to what it ought to be. I put the truck in gear. I turned the headlights back on. I pulled out of the pull-off and back onto the county road, heading north this time, heading home. I did not look in the mirror as I drove away. There was no need to. I knew exactly what was behind me, and for the first time in a very long time, I also knew exactly what was ahead. I drove home alone through the back roads. the way I always go when I am not in a hurry and want to think. The roads out of Millhaven at that hour were nearly empty, just the occasional set of headlights coming the other way. And the night on either side of the road was the deep rural dark that exists only outside of towns. The dark of fields and timber and creek bottoms where the light pollution from human settlements has not yet reached. The sky above the ridgeline was extraordinary. The Milky Way clearly visible now that the fireworks' smoke had dispersed on the breeze. A dense band of cold light stretching from one horizon to the other in the way it only does on clear summer nights far from cities. I drove with the windows down and the radio off, and I let the night air move through the cab and thought about what the coming weeks would look like. Dennis had walked me through the likely sequence several times, and I had a clear enough picture of it. Richard would retain attorneys. There would be motions and counter-motions and delays and the various procedural maneuvers that constitute the grammar of serious legal disputes. It would not be quick, and it would not be simple, and there would be days when it felt like nothing was moving, and the weight of it would settle back onto my shoulders in some form. But the foundation was solid and could not be moved. Patricia Wynn's forensic report was in the record. Gary Tilson's sworn statement was in the record. The date discrepancy and the repeated witness signature were in the record. The composition notebook, while not a legal instrument, was in the record as evidence of Earl Calhoun's documented intentions. These things did not expire and did not weaken with time. They would be there at the end of the process, the same as they were at the beginning. Patient and factual and immune to the kind of performance that Richard had built his public life upon. And at the end of the process, when the court had done what courts do when the evidence is sufficient and the law is clear, the farm would come back. Not to me personally, not as my property in any possessive sense. Because I was 62 years old and had lived without it for 6 years, and had made my peace in certain ways with what that meant for my own life. It would come back to the Calhoun family estate, to be settled properly according to what my father had actually intended, which Dennis had advised me was sufficiently documented between the authentic will fragments and the composition notebook to support a clear disposition. The south fields and the barn and the farmhouse would go to Carol and me, as our father had always said they would, and the 10 acres along the Calhoun branch, the Sycamore Creek land, would go to the town of Millhaven to be held in perpetuity as public land, as Earl Calhoun had written in the careful pressing hand of a man who knew his time was short, but his intention was permanent. Dennis had already been in preliminary contact with the Millhaven town attorney about this. The town had expressed, in the careful non-committal language of municipal officials who do not want to celebrate prematurely, what Dennis described as significant interest and genuine enthusiasm. The Parks Department had apparently asked whether there might be a way to name the property in honor of the donor. Dennis had relayed this question to me, and I had told him yes, that I thought my father would have found that fitting, and that if the town wanted to put a simple sign at the entrance to the creek path that said Earl Calhoun Memorial Park, I believed that was exactly the kind of modest and permanent recognition that suited the man it would be honoring. I thought about that sign as I drove through the dark. A simple painted board at the head of a path through second-growth timber leading down to a clear, cold creek, and a stand of enormous sycamores where children would fish and wade and sit on limestone banks in the summer, knowing nothing about the man whose name was on the sign at the top of the path, knowing only that the place was theirs, and it was free, and it was beautiful. I thought about how my father would have felt about that, about children he would never meet fishing the Calhoun branch on summer afternoons, long after everyone who remembered his name was gone. And I thought that this was exactly the kind of thing he had been thinking about in his armchair by the window in those last slow months, looking out at the land he had built and wondering what the right shape of leaving it was. He had known, he had written it down, and now it was going to happen. I turned onto my road and drove the last half-mile to my house and pulled into the driveway and cut the engine. The night was completely quiet around me. The way it gets out here after midnight. Just the insects and the occasional dog somewhere down the road, and the sound of the creek that runs at the bottom of my own small property. A different creek than the Calhoun branch, but made of the same ridge water, running over the same kind of limestone in the same direction toward the same river. I sat in the truck for a minute after I cut the engine, the way I sometimes do, just sitting in the dark with the windows down, listening to the night settle around me. The fireworks were long over. The town was quiet. Somewhere out on the county road, my father's farm was dark and still. The vinyl fence and the too-bright barn and the renovated farmhouse all sitting in the summer dark, waiting for the process that had already begun to work its way through to its conclusion. I was 62 years old. I had been a Marine and a farmer's son, and a man with a back injury, and a man with a grudge, and a man with a plan, and now, tonight, I was something I had not been in 6 years, which was a man with nothing left undone that could be done. The rest was the law's work, and the law had what it needed. I got out of the truck and stood in my driveway for a moment, looking up at the stars through the maple trees. The same stars my father had stood under on this same Tennessee ground for the better part of 80 years. The same stars that would be there long after my own name was on a headstone at Millhaven First Baptist. I thought about the man who knows where he comes from is never truly lost. And I thought that after 6 years of feeling like I was searching for something just out of reach, I finally knew exactly where I was. I was home. Not the home that had been taken and would be returned in time. My home. The place I had made for myself in the years since the Corps. The small house on the creek road where I had learned to be alone without being lonely. Where I had done the invisible work of 6 years in the kitchen and on the phone and in the dark on the county road. Where I had read my father's words by evening light and allowed myself to cry, and then allowed myself to stand up. I went inside. I did not turn on the television. I made a cup of coffee I did not really need and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet. And I thought about Earl James Calhoun, who bought a piece of ground in 1974 and spent his life making it into something worth being proud of. And I thought about how a man's work does not end when he does, how it continues in the people who loved him and in the land he tended, and in the clean, cold creek that will run over the same limestone long after all of us are gone. I sat with that for a long time, and then, for the first time in 6 years, I slept without dreaming. If you have listened this far, I am grateful for your company on this road. Some stories need to be told, not because they are extraordinary, but because they are true. Because they are the kind of thing that happens to ordinary people in ordinary towns, and because the people who live through them deserve to have someone bear witness. Thank you for bearing witness to this one, if it moved you or meant something to you. I hope you will share it with someone who might need to hear it, and if you have not yet subscribed, I would be glad to have you along for whatever comes next. God bless you. And God bless the honest men and women who build things worth leaving behind.